Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jeff Garrett, Dean of the Wharton School, and this is the Tarnopol Dean's lecture series. The lecture series honours a great alum of the Wharton School, Mickey Tarnopol, who graduated in 1958 and passed away about a decade ago. He had a really big career at Bear Stearns. He was a long-time member of the Wharton Board of Overseers, and he was the vice chair of Penn's Board of Trustees. Today we have a fantastic conversation in store for us all, which is going to be moderated by my boss, the head of the management department, where I'm a professor, Nancy Rothbard. Nancy is the David Pottruck Professor of Management. She's also chair of the management department. And she's somebody who practices what she preaches, or in fact what she researches. So Nancy is a real expert on organizational dynamics and on diversity in organizations and increasing them. And as I said, she practices what she preaches. Nancy did a spectacular job in increasing the diversity of the Wharton faculty in her first year as presiding chair over faculty recruitment in the management department. For those of you who might not know, more generally, we hired last year at Wharton the biggest class of incoming faculty ever. The total number of new hires, not everyone is here yet, is 26 new professors. Of the 26, 13 were women and 7 are underrepresented minorities. So those are off the charts better statistics than we've ever had before, but of course all that does is just raise the bar for the future. But thank you, Nancy, for your extraordinary role in making those great outcomes possible with an enormous heavy lifting by you personally. We're really, really fortunate to have to Nancy's left, to your right, Edith Cooper, who's the global head of human capital management at Goldman Sachs, responsible for only the recruitment, development, and well-being of Goldman Sachs' 35,000 people. She's been an EVP of the firm since 2011. I think you were a partner in, about 2000? Mm-hmm. And has led human capital management at Goldman Sachs since 2008, where she is currently also a member of Goldman's Management Committee and vice chair of the partnership committee, which is a quaint old thing that you've kept on, even though now Goldman is a public firm and therefore partners don't own chunks of the firm the way they used to. I know it's still a very important promotion for people at Goldman Sachs. You might have seen that in September it was announced that Edith is actually leaving Goldman at the end of this year. And we don't know what's next. I don't know whether she knows what's next, but we might have planted a question about that for our conversation. But I should end by also highlighting Edith's extraordinary work outside Goldman Sachs. She's an influencer on LinkedIn, writing about all matters of organizational dynamics, diversity, hiring, etc. She's been on Crane's Most Powerful Women's list, American Banker's Most Powerful Women's list. She's on the Board of Trustees of the Museum of Modern Art and Northwestern University, and she's also on the President's Council at Howard University. So we're in the presence of a truly extraordinary leader, and the most important thing I can do is to welcome Edith to the Wharton School and cede the microphone to Nancy Rothbard, who's going to start by conducting a conversation, and then I'm sure we'll open it up at an appropriate point to everyone in the audience. Again, Edith, thank you so much for making the big effort to be here today.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you and to be talking with you, Edith. I had the good fortune to sit in on one of my colleagues, the newly hired colleague, Stephanie Creary, who is sitting here in the audience. She's teaching a diversity class here at the school. It's the first diversity class we've had. And we had the great honor of having Analu Vasquez, your Chief Diversity Officer, come down yesterday and talk with us about what Goldman is doing in that space a little bit. And, one of the things that was really eye-opening for me was, just sort of the vast reach of the human capital management group. And I just thought maybe to start out, I'm not sure everybody knows here what that entails. And, I learned, Jeff said 35,000 employees and 800 employees within the human capital management group, right? Which I was sort of mind blown by that number, right? And so could you start off by telling us a little bit about what the group is and what your role is in that group?
Sure, and it is really a pleasure to be here and spend time with you all. So thanks for having me. So we often say that the firm is a people business. In fact, it is 35,000 of us. And if you just think about yourself and your expectations for environments where you're going to excel and what your future holds, and then multiply yourself by 35,000 people, it's a lot. Because the expectations of our people when they join to work in an environment where they can perform to their potential, thrive, and progress is appropriately very, very high. We operate all over the world, and in order for us to be relevant, we have to continue to make sure that we're bringing in terrific people. Now, we're not the only firm in the world who's going to proclaim that, right? We want great people. I think most organizations would say that. The important component of what we do within the Human Capital Management Division at the firm is that we've connected the recruitment to the experience, the promotion, the retention, and the advancement into a continuum, such that we pay attention at every step of the way. At every step, we've got to make sure that we are articulating the value proposition of working at the firm when we hire people. We have to make sure that we get the compensation and the benefits constructs right, multiplied in the, I think it's 50 or 60 different jurisdictions that we compensate and pay benefits for. And we have to make sure that we don't have just individuals, that we have a collective, and that we bring in the science of folks like Stephanie and Nancy around how we really create an environment and an organization that will really thrive. And that's what we do. We hire from almost 500 schools around the world. We hold ourselves accountable for continuing to expand that. We want to be systematic with our approach to how we think about people. In fact, it's more than a desire for us, it's a requirement because of the number of people and the scale at which we operate. And in order to create that scale, we've got to have things done programmatically, and we have to be very intentional about it. In conclusion, I'd also say that the way that we approach our people activities are very much similar to how we approach everything. If you want to do something well, you have to be intentional. You have to pay attention. And so therefore, what do we think when we say we want to hire great people? How do you define that? What are the mechanisms for evaluating it? How do we make sure that people are enforcing that when we interview? How do we make sure that everyone, regardless of what your economic background, ethnicity, culture, sexual orientation is, that you have the equal opportunity and access to growth within the firm? You have to be deliberate. It can't just be a spiritual thing that you're just doing the best that you can. And so we've really had to work hard to create things programmatically that give us scale to accomplish these things on a consistent basis.
Yeah, I was really impressed by the sort of the structural approach that you take, right? Sort of that's what you're saying with it's systematic. It's not just sort of on a whim, that you build in a lot of these systems and into the hiring process, into the promotion process, into the feedback process. And I think that that's something, that I was really struck by the number of initiatives that you have going around this, right?
Yeah, well, when you're paying attention and you're deliberate at every step, it gives you signals. Our job is to pay attention to those signals. And so therefore, and when we do, how do you create things programmatically to reinforce what you're trying to accomplish? And so, when we noticed that our hiring practices got too narrow, not just the number of schools that we hired from, because we hire from similar schools over and over again because they have a positive track record, but just in terms of the backgrounds and experience, we had to take a step back and say, okay, why is that? Well, probably because we're sending people to campus and they ask their own set of random questions that are a reflection of their own reality. When you do that, you're going to hire people who went to Harvard, who lived in Leverett House, and who ran the hamburger joint. That would be me, right? And so, see, you'd get a job too, because that's an experience that we share. And we really realized that that limited us. And so what do? We create a analysis. We do research with respect to what reasonable hiring practices are, what the right questions are. We test it with research. We test it in practice. We roll it out. And we do that over and over and over again.
And, you know, I think that what's so interesting about this, and I hear this from a lot of folks, right, in your kind of roles, is the sort of it's like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill, right? You have to put a lot of effort into it. You have to keep the pressure up, right? Because if you take your hands off, the ball starts rolling down, right?
And when you think about it, it really does make sense that you have to be consistent and you have to be deliberate and diligent, because it's just like everything else we do as an organization. It's just like everything that you do here. You just don't bring in faculty and say, oh, you know, I don't know the research that you've done. I'm not sure that you're, but just like give it a shot. You know, you walk into class, you'd hear immediately if the person, you know, really doesn't have what it takes to really share knowledge and inspire knowledge. You know, when we put people into jobs to advise clients on, you know, real economic decisions, or we put people in seats where they're putting the firm's capital at risk, we don't just say, hey, just give it a shot, do the best you can. No, we're very thorough. We measure it every day. It's called a P&L in the case of sales and trading. And so with respect to people, what we've really focused on in the last several years is having the same type of deliberate approach to it. And there's got to be some research, I'm sure, Nancy, you'll share it with me, where, you know, if you looked at an individual and the complexities of that individual and why they behave in a certain way, and then you think about the exponential complexity because we have individuals who are acting with a minimum of 1 to 20 to 50 to 100 people, I mean, I don't know what that equation would look like. It's really, really hard. And it's really complicated. And although we haven't reduced it to an equation, because after all, people are people, and there's sort of a humanistic side of it as well, it has caused us to have a lot more respect for the diligence that we have to put in if we're really trying to create that environment where people can really thrive.
Right, and I think the people analytics is also under your shop, right? You know, as an example of that, right?
Well, you know, the other, it's interesting that you highlighted that, because I think I'd probably be in this role, I don't know, a couple years, and you know, it's just when people analytics was taking off, I found myself here at Wharton at a conversation that was led by Adam Grant and others from the faculty, and I have to say, you know, that really resonated with me, because most of my career had been spent, you know, working with clients in our sales and trading business, and it was just all of a sudden I thought, well, you know, I know the analytics that we put into taking risk and advising our clients on and making recommendation. Now what I'm hearing is that we should start taking that same framework and applying it to people decisions. And it was almost like, oh my goodness, this, you know, you're speaking my language. And you know, we then started to bring, we didn't even have people within the division who were skilled or experienced in doing the data analytics, that now we have a team that focuses on it.
I think it's a really good fit. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. So when I was talking with you a couple of weeks ago, and we had a great conversation, and I was doing my research, my background research on you. I came across this great LinkedIn post that you have, which I'm going to just read the title to you all, which is "Why Goldman Sachs is Encouraging Employees to Talk About Race at Work, and Why, as a Black woman, I think this is so important." And so I just wanted to open this up and say, you know, why is this so important? Why is diversity and inclusion such a key issue that you see at Goldman and at, you know, institutions in general now?
Well, you know, it's so important that we have an environment where everyone can perform to their potential. it is what makes us relevant. It's why the dean started with, thanking you for the work that you've done in really creating diversity at the faculty level, because the assumption needs to be now and going forward that if you don't have it, you're not going to really have an environment of ideas and experiences that are critical to being a thought leader in anything. I know that sounds a little severe, but it's true. If you have one of the same thing, it just doesn't create that kind of idea, vig, and experience. You can imagine, when you think about the time where I wrote that piece, it was troubling. We'd come from a very difficult summer where 2 black men had been shot by police. There were officers that were, assassinated in Texas, and it came to a point where at the firm, our chairman and CEO, who I'd been talking to for a couple of years around creating more of a conversation around race, said, I've had enough. We had brought in thought leaders from a number of sectors. We had Cheryl and Eiffel from the LDF. We had Vernon Jordan come in. We had other civil rights leaders, really just to expand people's understanding. But he, I think, and we struggled, in hindsight maybe a little long, around why is this something that's relevant to a financial institution? It became relevant when we made it relevant, because we realized that for many of our people, many of our black professionals, but honestly broader, really felt very uncomfortable not working in a place where there was a real conversation around it. And so he sent out a voicemail, basically saying that, it was troubling to him and that we needed to have an environment where everyone could be comfortable and where everyone could perform to their potential. And it was a real big game changer. I remember walking into an auditorium probably 3 times the size of this, and it was packed. People were standing in the aisles. My partners were there, the analysts, the Summers were there. And it was a real moment that I'll never forget, because everybody wanted to figure out how to be part of the conversation. And it prompted that. It prompted more dialogue. For me, I'd been at the firm for almost 20 years. I'm in a role where I'm supposed to be and am responsible for the people of the firm. I've benefited so greatly from the experience of, not a couple of generations ago, my parents, who really thrived despite the segregated experience of growing up in the South. And I just ask myself the question, if not me, who's going to do it? And I felt like it was my responsibility to share my story in a way that encouraged other people to share theirs. That title, you can imagine how much time we spent on that. Mm-hmm. Why Goldman Sachs? Because it really actually wasn't just about me. It was about the fact that Goldman Sachs was a firm where it encouraged people like me to have a voice and have a perspective and to have a real honest moment on what it was like for me. And I think the thing that was wonderful about it was that, that the feedback was overall positive, but the stories that people shared with me as a result were incredible. So I heard from a hearing impaired colleague who sent me an email saying, I'm hearing impaired, and if I don't sit next to the speaker, I can't hear, and so I have to get to meetings a half an hour early. I've worked on my speech, but now I feel comfortable saying to my boss, listen, I can't hear you unless I'm sitting next to you. I mean, think about that. Think about that this person had been working at the firm and didn't feel comfortable with something as, for me, was so straightforward as saying, I can't hear you, can I sit in this place? Or a woman who had a Jewish last name who happened, but because she was married to someone who was Jewish but was Muslim, and so sat on her desk every day and listened to people gab and make comments, and she finally said, hey, no mas, you want to talk about this, let's have a real conversation. So it opened up dialogue and debate that was important for our Black community, was more important broadly for everyone. But I really firmly believe that when you start conversations generally, it spills over into your day-to-day business interactions as well, right? So you're sitting in a room and you're looking around, now you're conscious of the person who's different, who never says something. then you start realizing like, hey, I'm only hearing from the same two people. I got to fix that. You get better ideas, you get better conversations, you make broader impact.
I think that's really powerful, and there's a couple of directions I want to explore there, because I think one of the things that is really striking about the story you told here is that, you talk with your boss, who is, I'm assuming, not black.
That's true.
Lloyd,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Lloyd
Blankfein is not black.
right? He's
no.
not black. He's a man. He's right. I mean, so he's a white man, and he, and he sent the voicemail, right? And I think that one of the things, I mean, my colleague Sigal Barsaid and I, we had this really interesting conversation with Adam. You mentioned Adam Grant, who we co-teach a class with, along with Samir Nur Mohammed. And one of the things we were saying to Adam, we were talking about diversity and gender diversity, and he was initially really uncomfortable talking about it, because he was like, look, I'm this white guy, like, what do I have to say about this? I don't feel like I have the standing to say anything. And we were like, no, we need you to be talking about this too. We can't be the only ones talking about this, right? And I think that's a really, I think, important kind of link in this chain. And what was your, how did you, was it hard to convince him? You said it took a little bit, or
no,
or the moment was right? Like, what was the way that you did that effectively?
So it's so interesting. We were in a conversation earlier with Stephanie and some of the doctoral students, et cetera. And, this question of, should it always be the diverse person's job to be the voice came up. And so my experience over the years has been that, yes, it's true that I could spend 150% of my days talking about diversity things. I could. In many of my environments over the years, I was the most qualified in terms of, who I was, a black woman. But I also knew that, I had a job to do, and that at the end of the day, my voice was important, but if I could get it up into the leadership ranks of the firm, then that could be really powerful. And I was really fortunate to have had the experience in my early days to work, not for Lloyd Blankfein, but in the organization that he was responsible at the time. And so we'd had the opportunities over the years to have conversations, and he was generally interested. And that for me led to a level of trust, right? Where where I could say what I really believed, and he also trusted that he could say what he believed. And that led to an open conversation and candor that I think really helped when we got to the point where it was really important for the firm to have a conversation, that was appropriate. And I remember in one of these conversations, he said, if it were me, Lloyd Blankfein, I would be up there every day, because personally, this is something that I really care about. And he personally did that as the CEO of the firm with respect to the conversation on LGBT rights and marriage equality. And I kept going back to, but why is this different? And he saw that as a civil right, and it was very clear that if we didn't move forward on that, our people couldn't move around the world in the same way. But it was never that he didn't think that it was an important issue. It was it an issue that was important for Goldman? And it was, and we got there. Could we have gotten there earlier? I don't know whether it really matters, because the circumstances led to a level of dialogue that I thought made up for the time that we lost.
I think that's really, I think, a great example, right, of how that connection and that trust is really critical, though, sometimes to be able to have at that moment the right voice helping, get the message heard. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is when we think about kind of these diversity, inclusion kinds of issues, a lot of times we have a lot of challenges, because we were trying to make the business case, right? And you know, a lot of times this is how firms will talk about diversity. It's important for our clients, it's important, you know, et cetera. And that's part of it. But what's really interesting to me in the way you tell this story about why diversity is important to Goldman, it's not entirely about the business case. It's about that it's about the business case in terms of our, right? About our
but it's interesting,
people, right?
Because we've been on this journey,
Yeah,
right? I mean,
yeah.
we you know, years ago thought, oh, okay, so if we show that there are more diverse people in positions of power and therefore they're not going to be excited if we put the same type of people before them, and you know, let's come up with the evidence, and in some cases we had some, in some cases we not. Our business case is more compelling now than it's ever been, which is if we don't work to make sure that we have a population at every level that's a reflection of, you know, the source of talent, which is for the most part for us, people who have, for 99.9% are coming from, you know, universities or who have gone to universities. We hire a number of people laterally. If that's not diverse, I just believe we're not hiring the best people. And why is that? And so I think the business case is we really want to have that diversity of experience. The other thing is, if you look at our portfolio of businesses and our portfolio of clients, I mean, it just runs the gamut. And that requires different way of thinking and perspective, which is often, I would suspect, there's must help me with the research, correlation between that and, you know, idea generations and innovation. I see it, interesting enough, you know, there's all sorts of different ways you can cut this. Generational difference. You know, I have a great job, a really great job, because I, as part of my role, spend time with people on campuses, analysts, you know, who are second, third year students in universities. I spend time with graduate students, and I also spend time with people who are running the firm. How amazing an opportunity that is for me to have diversity of perspective. The generational experiences of someone who's, you know, a sophomore, junior, or senior in university versus me is mind-blowing. And I need to be in touch with that because that's the future of the firm. That's what's going to drive the next generation of ideas. So that's a clear example of why there's a real business case for understanding differences in perspectives.
Yeah, but I think it's there is a business case, but it's a different business case than what I often hear people talking about. It's more of a business case around the input side.
Yes.
Right, and it's and the kind of, but also about the inclusion piece. And that was the other piece I was kind of hearing a little bit in what you were saying, so that people, retention, right? So that we, you know, people feel like this is a place we want to be, and this is a place we're proud of. And I guess that was what I was hearing a little bit, and I just wondered if you had thoughts about that.
You know, we can move the needle in hiring, again, if we pay attention, right? And so therefore, when we think about how we talk about the experience of different jobs at the firm and how we brand, you know, these jobs, you know, we can and always strive to do better to have that appeal to the broadest universe of people. And, you know, we can move the needle with respect to the diversity of our incoming classes. But that doesn't really help us if after 2 years we start to lose people. And we start to lose people because we know for a fact that the experience of certain underrepresented groups is not the same as the majority. We realize that because we're paying attention. And so we got to the point where we were doing a very good job hiring black analysts, as an example, from universities, but people were leaving. And we got to the point where literally in certain divisions there were like 1 or 2, you know, black analysts left. Like, how does that happen? And believe me, I ask myself, how does that happen on my watch? And it was occurring because we really weren't paying attention to the experiences that were making a difference to how people were perceiving their contributions and their forward trajectory. And we had all the information, right? We had managers' review scores, we had individuals' review scores, we had, you know, the criteria of the candidates. So we looked at, you know, what is the data of the black analysts that we're hiring versus the majority? Exactly the same. What were the schools? Very, very similar. And so we knew that there was something that was going on in the environment, and we created a program called the Black Analyst Initiative, where we got all of the Black analysts, their managers, a coach, and a sponsor, which is a very senior person, involved in the person's professional experience. Now you might say, wow, that's like, quite a lot of attention, but we did it that way because we felt very strongly that it was as much for the manager, the coach, and the sponsor as it was for the Black analysts, because unfortunately, for many of these managers, they may not have had ever the experience of managing anyone who was very different than themselves, right? And we all know that people have preconceived notions about people before they even say anything. And we really needed to break that down. And through this initiative, we've seen a dramatic improvement in the retention. We've created more opportunities for mobility for everyone. And honestly, it's made our better managers better for everyone. Everyone. Anything that we do for our underrepresented population benefits everyone, because we get laser focused, we put some science and research behind it, and we over engineer it until it takes hold, and then everybody benefits from it.
And I think it's a great example of an initiative or a really concrete example of a program that you put in place very systematically and put all the structures around it. And I think that also leads to my next question, which is, why is this so hard, right? Why is this so hard? I know it's a big question, but.
Why is it so hard? Yeah. Because it's really hard. You can imagine, now that I'm moving on, I spend time reflecting, and because I'm just about as dizzy with data, I mark these things to market in my brain, and I think about where we are on the diversity front, and gosh, we got some good marks, right? We have many more female partners than we did when I took on this role, and we as a team moved the needle. We now have analysts who join the firm and stay at the firm, so that's really exciting. But there are other areas where we are still having a similar conversation, Nancy, and I think it's really hard because human dynamics are complicated, and we really haven't until recently sort of tried to tackle that. We had a really big breakthrough when we really challenged ourselves to think about unconscious bias, which historically we didn't go there because we put bias in there and oh my gosh, or people are going to think we're admitting to be a bias, and it gets really complicated and it's just way too hard. But we did, and we had all of our partners, managing directors, and vice presidents. So I would say that's probably, 16,000 people, spend 2 hours, going through experience of understanding their unconscious bias, and from the lens of not you're a bad person, you're a racist, you're sexist, you're homophobic, but rather you are a product of your experiences, and your experience will lead you to find common ground with people who are similar to yourselves, and that favorability that you show to that person actually is good for them, but bad for everyone else who's not feeling that kind of love. And that was I'm sorry, I kind of, broke it down to basic levels. But it was an aha moment for many of my colleagues, because it was like, oh, I get it. That I go to coffee with the same person that I went to school with. Oh, that's not good for the person who I never say good morning to. Oh, okay. And so now we're literally giving people tactics around, all right, pay attention. Who do you spend your time with in casual interactions? Who? Literally write it down at the end of the day. Look back at it at the end of the week. Be honest with yourselves. In meetings, who do you listen to? Who do you call on? Who do you follow up with? Pay attention. And that's simply a result of the fact that we raise the conversation to cultural things that were going on versus just figuring out how we could focus on this small population.
Yeah, I think that's a really great example, right? The unconscious bias training, and but it's slow, right?
It's
all
slow
of this is
because
slow.
You would think that I would get this instinctively, and I'd be like an A++ all the time, and I'd be perfect, and I am not. I'm not. I stylistically gravitate to people who are similar to myself. I do, right? And so, if you can go one-on-one with me and not be bothered that I interrupt you when you're trying to make your point with your beautiful presentation and know that that's good because I'm really interested, I think you're really smart. If you get intimidated by that and you just kind of shut down, I'm thinking, God, what's up with, I own that person's experience. And a lot of this work has made me realize that in owning that experience because of my stature or seniority, I own the responsibility of creating an environment where it's not everybody trying to adapt to me, but that I'm sensitive to how my actions impact other people. It's really hard. Sometimes I just want to get things done. Right. I want to go from A to B and with people that get me, I get them. But if it leads me to be interacting with a very narrow sector of people, that's just not acceptable. You just have to work at it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the research shows on diversity is that it can lead to better outcomes in terms of decision making, decision quality, in terms of creativity, all the things you were saying. But it also is hard. Sometimes the experience of it is hard and it's uncomfortable.
And what does the research show about why it's so hard?
Well, what you were saying about the one of the reasons it's so uncomfortable is that similarity attracts, and it's very difficult for us to move out of our comfort zone. And when people violate our expectations about how something should be done, we project ourselves onto other people, how we would do it, and what we think about the world, and that's really hard for us cognitively, right? And so I think that one of the things I think is really interesting, and we talked about a little bit in our call prior to this talk today, but I want to really ask you, because I thought you had a lot of really interesting things to share about this, is how do we talk about diversity more effectively? It's hard, right? I mean, it's important and it's hard. How do we talk about it effectively?
Yeah, so I think this is really important because the word diversity says different things to different people. Inclusion, I think, is more inclusive, but that doesn't even really get at it either. It's not organizations have to function. It's not just inclusion for inclusion's sake. It has to be for something, and I think that I've challenged the team actually to come up with a different word. Not diversity. Diversity isn't an experience, that word, it's an it. What we're trying to do is not an it, it's a collective interaction around people. We haven't come up with a word yet. Maybe I'll have more time to think about that now. But it's important that these conversations are resonating with everyone and you can hang something of yourself on it. And I read some of your research and it spoke to similarity and how perhaps that's not the right approach, finding something that's similar in someone else and you say, excellent, right. Nirvana, that's probably not ultimately the point. And I've been thinking about that, and that's exactly true. Because it's getting comfortable with the difference and not only comfortable, but intrigued and exploring it that really is the power of it. So that hearing impaired person could now relate to me, to my experience, her experience of difference, to my experience of difference. And everyone cares about it in a different way. I mean, again, maybe it's just human nature. When it's relative to you, you can kind of start to think about it and own it in a different way. And so, we'll continue to work on it. But the conversation has to be broad. After the session, story to tell, I think Lloyd asked something about, our perceptions of whether white people were sitting at home talking about, the shootings. And I said, I don't know. By definition, if I'm in the conversation, it's just not a group of white people. I don't know whether people are talking about it. And we went off into another conversation. One of my, colleagues who was a friend actually walked up and said, you said something that was really hurtful to me. I'm thinking, oh my God, what did I say? I had no idea what she was talking about. She goes, you said that you had no idea whether, a group of white people were talking about this. He said, my husband is an FBI agent. I'm from Ireland, we have 4 kids. Some of them are, I have an 11 and a 12-year-old. Like, do you think we're not human beings? You don't think we're paying attention to what's going on in society? I mean, I thought you knew me better than that. Of course we're talking about it. This is important to our country. And something, I just, all I could say was, that's a very good point. And I'm sorry. I didn't have that understanding. And, good for her that she got on me. Because I had I was like, I don't know what you people, what is that? If a group of white people had said that, can you imagine? Wouldn't have gone over so well. And so that, for me, this is why these things are so important to talk about and to be as inclusive as possible in those conversations.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that in some of my research that you were referencing is that being willing to talk about difference and not just fishing for the similarities is really important, and sort of having an open and genuine curiosity about that. But I think what you also have to do is be willing to give people the benefit of the doubt, right? Which is sort of what you were just, I think, implicitly talking about there, where you forgive them when they make a small misstep.
That's so
right?
important. And
because we stumble and make
do.
missteps, right, in these conversations.
And because they're hard, because our country and the world has had more instances than we can name around tragedy. And there's a lot of examples of where we haven't gotten it right as a society or multiple societies. And so therefore, I say it's really important to have conversations, but one of the things we've really tried to do is to create safe places for conversations where people only are charged with not being interested, but saying the wrong thing. We've got to, as long as it's not ridiculous, and unfortunately today is a time where we have to make that clear. But you got to be comfortable. You have to be okay with the fact that people just don't know, and I think it's worse not to go there because you don't know versus to try and to say something that's a little bit off. Everybody has their journey. I had years ago a reverse mentor who was gay, and it was not an experience that I knew much of. I have to be honest. I just didn't know. And, Arden is just awesome. And, we were talking about, the conversation, et cetera. And I said, I got to ask you, why do we need to talk about it? Isn't it? And it's interesting that I'm admitting this publicly. It's really scary, actually. I said, because, it's kind of what you do in your personal life. She looked at me and she goes, okay, let's just talk through that. And, she said, so you come in and you talk about your weekend and you talk about your husband. I come in and say, and they said, what did you do in the weekend? I went to the park. Okay, who'd you go to the park with? My friend. Well, what friend? Because you don't want to say my partner. You don't want to say my girlfriend. You don't want to say, now, I then shared that with one of my diversity colleagues, and she gasped with horror. Like, oh my God, I thought I trained you better. Like, how could you ask that? I didn't know. And I was in a safe place. And the only way I now know, and I have a deeper understanding and appreciation, it's not just understanding and tolerance, it's like deep understanding of how important it is for people to bring their true selves to work. If I hadn't had that opportunity to have the conversation, and we need to have more of that. And we therefore have to be prepared when someone says something that you think is like, really? Like, that sounds crazy. Like, what planet do you live on? That's probably not the first reaction. It's probably a follow-up question around, oh, that's an interesting perspective. Why do you think that? Let me just tell you how I'm hearing that. Let me just tell you why that doesn't resonate with me. Something that keeps the conversation going.
And I think that openness to having that conversation be a conversation and unfold is really critical to that. So I'm mindful of the time. I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions as well. But I want to just sort of, my last question is, Jeff had mentioned that you're moving your role, you're moving on in a couple at the end of the year, and I'm wondering what's next for you.
That's a good question. And after 35 years in finance and 20 plus years at Goldman, it's a very big question for me. And I'm going to go on to the next big thing where I'm comfortable being uncomfortable. And there's a lot out there that makes me uncomfortable, given I've spent my whole career in finance. You know, I've realized that, you know, what we do with respect to, you know, people and talent is really about how do you create effective organizations for impact. And so I'm excited about exploring a number of different avenues to continue to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I want to open it up for questions. If you guys have questions, you can just sort of raise your hand, and then if you ask, stand up so that we can hear you. Open up the floor. Yeah? You want to stand up? Yeah.
Hi, Alexa. Sure. Let life get in the way. So, you know, when I graduated from college, I went straight to business school at night and worked at a bank because I wanted to go to business school because I wanted to open a store. Okay, that's the long and short of it. And I've been in finance ever since. But for the first, 5, 6 years, I spent most of my energy trying to figure out how to get out of finance because I felt like I really wasn't making an impact to society and moving money from A to B, and was it relevant? And maybe I should have been a doctor, but I really couldn't stand blood, and I couldn't get through organic chemistry. And I mean, literally, just like the constant, you know, okay, today's Tuesday, I think I'm going to go right. Today's Thursday, I think and so I started covering clients, and that was the first thing that kind of piqued my interest. Like, okay, well, there's human beings there. I can, you know, it's really interesting. I get out of my own reality. I kind of like that. But still, it wasn't enough for me. And I got married, and my husband and I had our first child, and all of a sudden, it wasn't just about me. And I had to actually start to obsess less about, you know, today's Tuesday, which direction am I going to go into? I just had to figure out, like, how do I get it all done? You know, my babysitter left at 6:15, and my husband worked in finance at that time. So, you know, we had to trade off, and how could we be more efficient in my job? And oh, by the way, I started covering clients, and I really enjoyed that. And so, you know, the confluence of the events made me deprioritize my wandering, really focus on the job that I was doing. I really started to get traction. I started to develop important client relationships. And I let life get in the way. You know, did it at the time, you know, if I look back, would I have gotten to that next promotion maybe faster? Would I have, but you know, maybe that was a kind of an odd benefit of the time, that I didn't know every minute of every day how all of my colleagues and peers were doing, because I couldn't look at Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn to find out, you know, how many times people changed jobs in the last 2 years, because, you know, and I didn't have time to be calling around to figure it out. And so I let life get in the way. I started getting progress with my clients, and I wasn't obsessed with getting to the finish line on someone else's time frame. And that made a huge difference, because if I had done that, I probably would have been crushed by the fact that, you know, maybe, I'm not sure, I would have gotten something earlier. I got there eventually, and that's worked out. And you know, I have 3 children. I'm married, and it works. It works. But I've never been perfect at all of those things at the same time. Never.
Hello, I'm Zadam. You talked about like specific things and being aware of like who you call out, how do you not network. So I'm just asking. So for example, if I have a super reactive film tomorrow.
If you have what?
If, for example, I have an interview tomorrow at your firm, and my hairdresser right now to twist my hair. And should I be worried going to interview with this? And how do you actually?
Well, the good news is the person you're interviewing with isn't probably going to be able to judge whether your twist is perfect or not. I think you're good.
Just in general, like you guys talk about to recruiters or.
You know, I will tell you, that is, you know, listen, we were talking about this as well. You know, if you walk around our building, you take elevators up to what we call a sky lobby, and it's a launch pad to the upper building. And I literally now, some days, stand there and I watch people walk by, and I think, we are making progress for sure. Because the hairstyles are quite something. And I say that with a smile on my face, because if you had asked me 10 years ago whether we would have African American people with twists, I would have gone, well, I mean, I guess you could do it. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you know, and pull them aside and, you know, don't you really want to cut your hair? And I don't really, and that's not the case for the most part. For the most part. But so I think we're making progress. I would say that, you know, when I'm asked, do you bring your true self to work? And, you know, are you exactly the same person outside of the office that you are in the office? The answer to that is no. I do not dress like this at home. I don't. On a Saturday, if you see me in the afternoon, I will probably still have my running clothes on, much to the dismay of my family and friends. You know, but because I can, what was the word we were using earlier?
Bringing your best self?
Yeah.
Or your appropriate self?
Appropriate.
Your appropriate
now,
self.
then you could get into this whole conversation around, is that fair and is appropriate? Like, why can't I wear shorts? Because my brain operates in the same way if I have on shorts or long pants. Really? You know, you got to really think about the culture that you're joining, and if it's really important for you to wear shorts and flip-flops, then you're not a bad human being. You're probably not going to want to work in investment banking at Goldman Sachs. And it could be our loss. It really actually could be our loss, and hopefully we'll evolve to that. But those are the kinds of things you have to think about when you think about culture and things that really matter. Thank goodness we've moved beyond hairstyle. But there are sort of things that I am at work that I'm not, and that's okay with me, because they're not the same place in my mind.
Make sure I'm not neglecting this part of the room. Here you go.
Given that all, you know, races, backgrounds, ethnicities have the same capacity for intelligence and have the same, you know, work ethic, etc., can you foster diversity purely through meritocratic hiring, or do you always need to have some sort of supplement, and why?
I think you can. I think that if you don't have diversity, you don't have meritocratic hiring. That's aggressive, right? But understand that this is not, like, this isn't there's no, that's aggressive. I'll speak about our organization. You know, if you're applying to the technology division, you take a hacker rank exam, and you have to get above a certain point to get an interview. But then it goes into more subjectivity, right? And as soon as you start down that path, I would say that we have to work hard to make sure that it is a meritocracy by making sure that we pay attention to biases that exist in the human interaction of interviewing. And, you know, that's why, and I know that some folks here really challenged us on it, we went to video interviewing because we felt, which by the way has worked fine for Wharton, and for Penn generally, you guys get it done, let me just tell you. Because we, at the analyst level, not at the business school level, because we know that people who go to interview on campus bring to the conversations previous experiences, and that influences who you think is great. Quite frankly, if you get someone first thing in the morning versus the last interview before you have to leave to catch your train, you'll get more vig in the morning than the afternoon. So we've really worked hard to break that down, and that's how we're going into this. Think about it, if 50% of the students at universities where we recruit are women, and in any of our businesses, only 20% of the interns are women, there's something that's not right there, right? We're not telling our story right, we're not getting enough applicants, we're not interviewing right. I think meritocracy and diversity are very much aligned. Wow, you touched on a number of things there. You're right. We will proclaim, and everyone at the firm will proclaim that our number one asset is our people. Everyone will say that. But I haven't for a minute taken it for granted that we have to prove our worth. In the same way that if you're covering clients, you have to show that you're doing business. We have had to, within human capital management, create metrics and frameworks around the impact of the work that we're doing, right? And so, historically, we'd have people recruiting, and success was getting the bodies in the door, but we actually didn't look back to see whether the people performed or not, right? That's not how to run a commercial enterprise. You've got to really hold yourself accountable for, focusing on, the numbers, but also the definition of success and impact across all of these different metrics. And that's made a really big difference. If we're going to launch something that is intense as this Black Analyst Initiative, I will show that it has made a difference, or we will stop doing it, right? Because that's what you do in a commercial enterprise. You just don't keep doing things, just so you can have a list of things that you're doing programmatically. When we look at compensation, we have a culture of accountability, and we pay for performance of an individual, of divisions, of functions, but most importantly, the firm. That's what we owe to our shareholders. And when we think about whether we've gotten compensation right, we hold ourselves accountable to that. Are the people that we're paying performing well? Are people leaving who we thought should be staying? How are we doing from a benchmarking perspective? There's nothing that we should be doing that we put people and resources against that we cannot demonstrate has made a difference. Now, there are harder parts of that. Like when we've spent a lot of time talking about creating a culture of conversation. How do you show that those conversations matter? Some things you just have to go with because you believe it to be true, right? And then you could start hanging things on it. But at the end of the day, we are dealing with people. And so therefore, there's a common sense component to this stuff where if you believe that it's creating important conversation and thinking, then you believe in that impact. But it's not everything, but you can't also become so mechanical about it that you really miss the point. And the point is, do people thrive in the environment where you're working? And do they want to come to work every day?
Thank you for coming here to share your insight with us. I want to ask you, during your time at Goldman Sachs, which affinity group do you think has advanced its cause the most? And what do you think the other affinity group needs to do in order to get more airtime and advance their cause as well within Goldman Sachs?
Another great question. When you look at, let's just talk about the last 20 years, okay, which is my time frame. When we did the first diversity task force, which was in 2000, so I'd been at the firm about 4 years, and we had consultants, we got senior leaders in. There were 3 groups that we focused on, Black, Latino, one category, non-US people and women. And there was a lot to say about women. There were way more, but still limited number of female partners, but there were some. And we were growing our non-US partners. And so, you know, when you think about that, and at the time I was the third black partner in the firm's 120-year history and the first woman. So I would say that, therefore, it's not crazy to say that there was more momentum around women at that time, and there was no focus on LGBT, so that is for sure. Fast forward to today, I think that we have very strong affinity networks across gender, sexual orientation, disability, Hispanic, Latino, and Black population. We have an Asian network as well. We have a veterans network. I mean, it's expanded. And, you know, real talk, there are times where, you know, certain populations, the Black population, you know, can be frustrating because we've made progress, but gosh, it's been so much harder in some ways. But on the other hand, I would say that there's been benefits to, you know, the close-knit community that we have at a partner level. I mean, we get together every other week, all of our partners, Black partners, and that's powerful. We know all of the MDs, we know all of the partner, and we will stop someone in the hallway that's an analyst or associate if we think they're not walking down the hall the right way. As you know, just as an analogy, not literally, but we know all about them, and that's powerful. So we punch above our weight, but we have to, because we don't have the numbers that other networks do. The one thing I would say that has been important across the spectrum is that our networks have always been open to anyone that's wanted to join, but the LGBT population aggressively pursued the ally strategy, which I thought was very powerful. And you know, I think that we've all benefited from that, because when you go to any network event, because we have all of these, all the different History Month celebrations, you'll see that there's more diversity. And I think, therefore, they set that tone that made it very compelling for all of us to think about that as well. Although, but in practice, you can join any network you want at the firm.
So I think that this has been a great set of questions from you guys. I want to thank you for, you know, for such great, insightful questions, and turn it back over to Jeff to close us out.
Very, very briefly, we do have to end the session on time because Edith's got to get on a train, and they don't wait. Even for you, I don't think Amtrak is going to wait. Look, this has been an extraordinary session. I think two big takeaways for me are a couple of challenges that you've overcome. The first one is the challenge, as was politely asked in one of the questions. If you're in a people business, how come the HR function isn't at the core of the business? And you've clearly, personally, done an extraordinary job there. And the second one is the challenge that all leaders face today, which is how in a high visibility, high pressure job do you remain authentic to who you are and to the job. And I think it's pretty clear that you've knocked that one out of the park. So on behalf of the school, it's my real pleasure to thank you for being here today. And I wanted to thank Nancy for doing such a wonderful job as being moderator. So thank you both very much. And thanks to everyone for coming. We do have to get Edith out, but if you want to say hi, maybe we've saved a couple of minutes for that to happen. Thank you all very much. Good evening.